Along the cypress-lined tributaries of the Combahee River in South Carolina's Beaufort district, a strange and cruel ritual unfolded every Sunday evening for nearly 8 years. Historical records from the Harfield Plantation show a distinct anomaly. No enslaved woman over the age of 14 was ever sold or separated from the property between 1847 and 1855. This unusual stability quietly raised questions among neighboring planters. The core of the mystery lay in a weekly game that involved no physical violence, yet left its 37 participants profoundly psychologically scarred. Those who witnessed the women afterward spoke of a collective silence so deep that overseers resorted to communicating with them only through gestures. This insidious ritual was designed by a wealthy landowner, educated in Europe, who sought to transform routine brutality into a deep, hidden form of psychological control. The Harfield Plantation, a 2,000-acre estate built on rice and the labor of over 200 enslaved people, was sold in 1846 to Baron Edward Fournier. Fournier, a 42-year-old unmarried man of refinement, carried himself with the scholarly air of European universities. His vast library included texts on Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon and philosophical works on duty and obedience. Fournier's governing philosophy, which he detailed in private letters, was that the science of control lay not in the lash, but in the architecture of the mind. He viewed his captive population as subjects for social experiments, transforming the Low Country's isolation into a laboratory for control. Among the enslaved people were 37 women and girls, over 14, whose names like Hannah, Patience, and Diawa, recorded in Fournier's ledgers with unusual notations. He recorded measurements of head circumference, temperament, and apparent intelligence, treating human beings as subjects for study. Within weeks of his arrival, Fournier mandated that every enslaved woman and girl over 14 attend a mandatory gathering every Sunday evening in a converted tobacco barn. He set up cushioned benches in a semicircle and barred white overseers. Fournier conducted the meetings alone, assisted only by a free woman of color named Celeste Marant, whom he brought from Louisiana to record observations. The first gathering, on October 18, 1846, was deeply unsettling. Fournier stood before the women, dressed in a fine suit, speaking in a soft, gentle voice that lacked the expected harshness of white authority. This studied courtesy was more terrifying than overt violence. "Ladies," he began, a word never used for enslaved women, "we gather here to engage in an exercise that I believe will prove beneficial to all." He insisted that if they followed the rules precisely, no harm would come to them, and then gestured toward a leather-bound journal and inkwell on a small table. Fournier stood before the women and revealed the mechanism of his control, holding aloft a ledger containing every name on the property. "Each week, we will play a game of sorts," he announced in his soft voice. The rules were simple but devastating. The women must cast secret ballots to choose one person from the book. The person who received the most votes would be subject to a consequence, determined solely by Fournier. Abstention was strictly forbidden, and the consequence might range from a reduced ration to a harsher work assignment. He immediately established the psychological trap by warning them that any pattern suggesting coordination or conspiracy would result in a punishment far worse than honest participation. The game required genuine choice, forcing them to consider who in their community was most deserving of suffering. Celeste Marchant, the free woman of color, distributed paper and charcoal, her face unreadable as the women struggled with the impossible choice. To vote for anyone was to become an agent of their own oppression, but to refuse was to invite an undefined, greater horror. Hannah, the 23-year-old field hand, realized the sick strategy of the game. Even self-sacrificed voting for herself became a way of abandoning her 2 children. The fear was layered with shame. As they understood, Fournier had constructed a scenario where self-preservation meant betraying a neighbor. The votes were cast and counted. Lily, age 53, known for her kindness and herbal remedies, received the most votes. Fournier's consequence was purely psychological. For the entire next week, Lily was forbidden from speaking to anyone unless directly addressed by a white overseer. As the women filed out, the profound horror was clear. They had been forced into complicity, selecting one of their most beloved members to suffer. The silence that followed was heavy with shame and the terrible knowledge that the game would continue. For the next 8 years, the weekly ritual ground on its effects, fracturing the community. The consequences varied unpredictably, from reducing food rations to assigning brutal labor in the rice fields. At times, the consequence was the public humiliation of standing in the center of the circle while Fournier read aloud his observations about their character, perceived weaknesses, or secret fears. The architectural genius of Fournier's game lay in its invisibility and sustainability. On the surface, it was a harmless meeting, but its mechanism of control operated entirely within the psychology of mistrust. The bonds of solidarity began to erode, replaced by knowing suspicion. Did she vote for me? Fournier meticulously recorded the voting patterns, attempting to create a twisted, pseudoscientific taxonomy of human nature under duress, documenting the breakdown of communal loyalty for his French colleagues. Yet, subtle forms of resistance emerged. Some women attempted to distribute the votes as evenly as possible to prevent repeated victimization. Others, in quiet rebellion, voted consistently for themselves. An act of self-sacrifice Fournier struggled to categorize as conspiracy. Hannah emerged as an unelected leader, maintaining the threads of community by visiting the selected woman each week, offering comfort and maintaining a form of silent testimony against the Baron's psychological warfare. Despite the systematic psychological warfare, the women maintained a core belief. We are still human, still capable of care. Paradoxically, Harfield's output remained consistently strong, with abundant rice harvests. Fournier's reputation grew among the planter class as a man of modern methods and efficient management. Visitors, like a Charleston factor in 1851, noted the unusual quietness of the women, interpreting their silence as docility and good discipline. What they failed to see was a collective trauma response. The women had learned that speech was dangerous, and their words could be used against them in the next iteration of the game. They communicated instead through subtle glances, gestures, and the small, shared languages of a community under siege. The years passed with the weekly horror continuing. In the spring of 1852, a critical line was crossed. Hannah's daughter, Sarah, turned 14 and was added to the Sunday gathering. This violation spurred Hannah into action. That night, Sarah asked her mother the crucial, naive question. "Mama, why don't we all just refuse? What could he do if every single one of us simply sat there and didn't vote?" Sarah's question crystallized Hannah's long-held realization. Fournier's sophisticated cruelty was fragile because it depended entirely on their participation. Unlike a traditional overseer who relied on physical punishment, Fournier's control rested on psychological submission. Hannah began observing Fournier more closely, noticing that when votes were too evenly distributed, his composure flickered, and his hands would clench. She also watched Celeste Marant, the free woman assisting the Baron, catching moments of pain or prayer in her expression, suggesting her neutrality was straining. Throughout the summer of 1852, as the low-country heat intensified, the women began communicating resistance in ways undetectable by Fournier. The voting patterns, previously semi-random, started showing deliberate structure. One week, almost every single vote went to Patience, a strong, resilient house servant. The next week the vote was split perfectly evenly among all 38 women, forcing Fournier to cast the deciding vote himself, a scenario his system hadn't accounted for. Each new rule Fournier created to counter this subversion only added complexity, creating more opportunities for the women to resist. By the fall of 1853, Fournier's meticulous journal entries showed his frustration. "The subjects have developed strategies I did not anticipate. They have found a way to comply while simultaneously resisting." He attempted to regain control by redesigning the game entirely. The women would now vote for who should receive a reward: better food, lighter work, visiting privileges, transforming the ritual from inflicting harm to granting benefit, and thus denying it to everyone else. The first week, under the new reward rules, the vote was nearly unanimous. 36 women voted for Sarah, Hannah's daughter. This was an act of collective defiance, disguised as compliance, a message of protection for the youngest and the one who had articulated refusal. Fournier was forced to grant the reward, but he couldn't interpret the votes. True meaning, as the subtle resistance continued. Celeste Morant, who had maintained her neutrality for 7 years, began to crack, making small but noticeable mistakes, like miscounting votes or arriving late to the gatherings. Fournier's anger boiled over when Celeste Morant made a critical blunder, distributing ballots with names already written on them, exposing her likely attempt at subversion. He sent her from the room in fury. Hannah, observing this, wondered if Celeste was an ally or simply a victim reaching her breaking point, recognizing that any real change would require help from someone with access to the white man's domain. During the unusual cold snap of the winter of 1853-54, Hannah made a critical decision. Unable to end the game through direct refusal, she chose to ensure the story's survival. She began to commit every detail of the game to memory with precision names, dates, rules, and consequences, and taught this entire litany to her daughter, Sarah. Hannah told her, "If we don't survive this, you will, and you'll remember. You'll tell what happened here." But Hannah needed more than memory. She needed documentation that could not be dismissed. The opportunity arrived in March 1854, when Celeste Merchant quietly approached Hannah in the laundry, risking severe punishment for the unauthorized conversation. Celeste confessed that she had once been enslaved and that Fournier had bought her freedom in exchange for her assistance with his research. She now understood the psychological devastation being inflicted, which was arguably more profound than physical violence. Celeste revealed that she had meticulously copied pages from Fournier's journal's evidence, written in his own hand, documenting the systematic torture, but she was powerless to use them. Hannah and Celeste began a high-risk operation. Over the following months, Celeste secretly copied the voting records, consequences, and the Baron's pseudoscientific analysis, hiding the pages in scattered locations across the plantation, buried in a jar, tucked into rafters, and concealed behind loose boards. Hannah memorized the mental map of the evidence. The dangerous alliance shattered suddenly. Celeste made a single mistake, leaving an original journal page out of sequence on Fournier's desk. That evening, he summoned Celeste to his study, and her screams were heard across the plantation yard. When she emerged hours later, she was clearly injured, bruised, and walking rigidly. Celeste was absent from the Sunday gatherings from then on, leaving Hannah with the knowledge that the precious records were now vulnerable to Fournier's discovery. On May 15, 1854, another Sunday arrived, but the air was charged with a different tension. Fournier was agitated, his movements jerky, muttering to himself in French. When the bell rang, the 38 women proceeded to the tobacco barn with heightened awareness. Inside, the usual arrangement was gone. The benches were pushed back, and in the center stood a single, ominous chair, coils of rope, and a large un familiar, léger. When Fournier turned to face them, his appearance was shocking. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, and his meticulous composure was gone. "Tonight's gathering will be different from all the others," he stated, his voice trembling. "Tonight we reach the conclusion of our long experiment." As the women arranged themselves, Celeste emerged from the shadows. The sight of her face swollen, lips split, moving with the rigidity of someone in tremendous pain, drew audible gasps, confirming Hannah's worst fears about her sacrifice. Celeste Morant, the free woman assisting Fournier, entered the barn with a blank, dissociated stare, suggesting her spirit was broken. She placed several coils of rope near the isolated chair, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Fournier began pacing erratically, confessing that his 8 years of observation had taught him that the enslaved women possessed a cunning that defies rational categorization, subverting his experiment through subtle manipulations of the voting patterns. He declared that documentation was no longer sufficient. Science required testing hypotheses to their ultimate conclusions. "Tonight, the game becomes what it was always meant to be," Fournier announced, his voice rising in pitch. "Tonight, you vote for who lives." He explained that the person who received the most votes would be spared, manumitted, and given money to travel north. Everyone else, all 37 others, would face death. He confirmed that his overseers and white servants were absent, ensuring no one with legal standing would witness the slaughter. He then dramatically laid out the voting materials alongside a large pistol and ammunition on the table, meticulously arranging the instruments of death. Fournier, now taking on a lecturing tone, warned them that refusal or coordination would lead him to make the selection himself, in a manner designed to maximize your suffering. Hannah's mind raced, realizing that every choice refusal, random vote, or collective vote led to the same catastrophic outcome for 37 people. Yet, the extremity of Fournier's plan suggested weakness, not strength. His final escalation was an act of desperation because his theories were collapsing. Hannah noticed Celeste's injured state and her position near the door. Realizing the free woman was now an unwilling victim and a potential ally, so, what difference does it make if I vote or not? Fournier's face flushed dark red as he lunged toward the pistol. Before he could reach it, Hannah stepped forward, placing herself between him and her daughter. "No," she declared, releasing 8 years of accumulated rage. "We're not doing this." Fournier was shocked. Hannah seized the momentum, interrupting his threat. "Your game requires our participation, and we're done participating." She turned to the other women, her voice ringing with finality. "He's going to kill us anyway, so we have nothing left to lose by refusing. We're not voting. We're not going to play his game anymore." Patience was the first to move, stepping forward to stand beside Hannah. Then Minnie. Then Dia. One by one, all 38 women rose from the walls and moved into the center of the barn, forming a collective barrier, a living wall of absolute, non-compliant refusal. Fournier stared at the unified group, his face a terrifying mix of disbelief, rage, and dawning fear. Fournier, his hand shaking, pointed the pistol at Hannah and then swept it across the assembled women, his voice losing its authority as he watched his life's work crumble. "You're making a mistake," he claimed, asserting his authority and the means to enforce the consequences. Hannah, however, took a defiant step closer, her voice hard as iron, dismantling his threat. "Kill all of us? Shoot 38 women one by one. Do you have enough ammunition for that? Enough time, ... Enough strength to dispose of all our bodies before morning?" She continued, hitting the core truth. If he resorted to mass murder, he would merely prove he was no different from any other enslaver, admitting that all his talk of science and psychology was just a fancy way of dressing up the same old violence. This truth shattered Fournier's self-image as a man of intellect. Hannah pressed the attack softly. "Whatever you believed you were building here, it's dead. We killed it by refusing to help you anymore. And you know what? We're still here." As Fournier's finger tightened on the trigger, the moment of ultimate tension snapped when Celeste Morant moved. She let the remaining voting papers fall to the floor. "I can't do this anymore," Celeste confessed, tears streaming down her bruised face. She realized she'd been as trapped as the enslaved women, forced to pretend she had a choice. She declared herself done, saying if they were to die, they would at least die refusing to be part of his sick experiment. Celeste's simultaneous rebellion broke Fournier. The pistol slowly lowered, his strength draining away. "Get out," he whispered, surrendering. Hannah, the last to leave, paused to look back at Fournier, who had collapsed in the isolated chair, the pistol forgotten beside him. She felt no triumph, only sorrow for all that had been lost. "We were always human beings," she told him quietly. "You could have learned that without torturing us." The women emerged into the night, weeping with relief and the disorienting sensation of having survived an impossible moment. The night of May 15th, 1854, marked the last of the Sunday gatherings, but not the end of Fournier's presence. Hannah spent the night with Celeste, tending her injuries and listening to her confession. Celeste revealed that Fournier had been breaking down for months due to the women's subversion. He was terrified that his work would be exposed, judging him as merely cruel rather than the intellectual he believed himself to be. The following morning brought an eerie normalcy. The overseer, Jacob Trent, returned, and Fournier, in a flat, emotionless voice, simply stated, "The experiment is concluded. There will be no more Sunday gatherings." Over the following days, Fournier stopped managing the plantation, retreating into his study, often found disheveled and muttering in French. Hannah used this period of neglect to take action. Working with Celeste and other trusted women, she retrieved all the copied documents that Celeste had hidden from Fournier's journals, discovering there were more pages than they had anticipated. Hannah and the women discovered that Celeste had copied over 200 pages of Fournier's journals, chronicling every vote, consequence, and his pseudoscientific analysis. Realizing they couldn't destroy this sole evidence, yet couldn't risk keeping it on the plantation, Hannah made a crucial decision to create a distributed archive. Over several weeks, she risked severe punishment to smuggle portions of the documents off the property, entrusting them to trusted free black individuals who understood their significance. One key recipient was Reverend Thomas Jenkins, a free black minister, whom Hannah begged to ensure the truth was known if they did not survive. Other portions went to a free woman running a boarding house and a black barber, creating a network that protected the history from complete destruction. As June arrived, Fournier's deterioration accelerated. The plantation's financial records became irregular, and management effectively collapsed. As he retreated further, the enslaved population existed in a state of suspended animation. The Sunday gatherings were over, but the psychological trauma of 8 years of forced complicity remained, manifesting as deeper silence and nightmares. Hannah focused on teaching her 14-year-old daughter, Sarah, the delicate balance required for an enslaved person. "You have to know when to resist and when to survive," she warned. But she could still see the dangerous fire of defiance in Sarah's eyes. In July, during an oppressive heatwave, a gaunt and feverish Fournier emerged to inform the overseer, Trent, that the plantation was to be sold immediately. Desperate to be rid of the property, he accepted a price below market value. The buyer, William Hawkins, was known for brutal efficiency, but lacked Fournier's psychological methods. News of the impending sale, set for mid-August, brought mixed fear and cautious hope, signaling the end of the Baron's presence. However, on August 9th, 1854, Fournier fell seriously ill with a fever and chills, which rapidly progressed into delirium. Raving in French about failed experiments and subjects who wouldn't cooperate, his skin turned yellow, suggesting marsh fever or possibly yellow fever. Celeste was reluctantly called to care for him during his final, terrifying days. She later told Hannah that even in his fever, Fournier continued to defend his theories, unable to accept that the failure lay in the fundamental wrongness of his design. Celeste also witnessed rare moments of clarity, where Fournier confessed, "I thought I was better than the others, but I was worse, wasn't I? Worse because I made them complicit." Celeste performed her duties without offering comfort. Fournier died on August 17, 1854, 3 days before the scheduled transfer. Though marsh fever was the official cause, whispers circulated about the convenient timing and Celeste's knowledge of herbs, but no investigation was conducted. The sale proceeded, and William Hawkins took possession. The tobacco barn was immediately converted to storage, removing all trace of the ritual. For the women, the transition brought relief, but not healing. Trust was hard to rebuild, and the silence developed as a survival mechanism proved difficult to break. Hannah became an informal counselor, understanding that the trauma lingered in their learned responses long after the source of the danger was gone. The women of Harfield had endured, supporting each other and clinging to the hope of freedom from the entire system of enslavement. The Civil War arrived 7 years later, bringing emancipation, a day which Hannah lived to see. Sadly, her daughter Sarah died in 1863 during an outbreak of disease on the plantation, a casualty of wartime deprivation. Hannah mourned Sarah with fierce grief, having fought so hard only to lose her to circumstances beyond control. After the war, Hannah settled in Beaufort, working as a laundress and midwife. She became a beloved grandmother figure in the community, known for her wisdom. During these years, Hannah focused on preserving the story, knowing the documents were scattered and fragile. She committed the entire history of Fournier's experiment to oral tradition, teaching younger people the details of the game and More importantly, how we survived it. She insisted the story was necessary, demonstrating how they held onto their humanity even when everything was designed to strip it away. Hannah died in 1881, satisfied that the truth was preserved in multiple forms. The hidden documents and the living oral history. The documents began to resurface in the early 20th century. Reverend Jenkins' daughter found the package entrusted to him and donated it to a historical society focused on preserving African American history. Over time, the scattered documents were consolidated, eventually becoming recognized by scholars as a unique and disturbing primary source. Fournier's journals, detailing not just his actions but his pseudoscientific rationale, provided a rare dual perspective: the enslaver's rationale alongside the enslaved people's experience. Modern psychologists recognize Fournier's game as an extreme example of participatory oppression, a system where victims are forced into coerced complicity, inflicting psychological damage more profound than simple violence. Historians agree that while the specific Sunday game was unique, the underlying principle of using psychological manipulation to control enslaved people was common. The story raises uncomfortable questions about scientific ethics, as Fournier genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate research, mirroring later unethical human experimentation like the Tuskegee study. Most powerfully, the Harfield story demonstrates the extraordinary resilience and resistance of enslaved people. The women's final collective refusal to participate in the face of death stands as a profound testimony to human dignity under extreme duress. They proved they could find a way to withdraw participation from a system that depended on their psychological submission. Today, the tobacco barn still stands, and a historical marker placed there in 2018 briefly describes the significance of the Sunday gatherings. Descendants of those enslaved at Harfield now gather annually near the site to remember and honor the women. These gatherings include a reading of the 38 women's names, followed by a deliberate silence, transforming the silence that was once a tool of oppression into a moment of respect and remembrance. The story of Harfield provides crucial evidence about the psychological dimensions of slavery, and serves as a reminder that the mechanisms of control, which rely on complicity and shame, are tactics that persist in various forms even today. Their courage deserves to be remembered, and their resistance deserves to be honored.